Okay, so picture this. You think you have the perfect marriage, and then your husband turns the tables on you in the most savage way possible. I'm Jennifer, I'm 32, and this is honestly the most insane thing that's ever happened to me. So Gary and I have been married for 6 years, together for 8 total. On paper, we looked like the perfect couple. I work in office administration, and he does something with technical support. Honestly, I never paid that much attention to the details of his job because it's pretty boring. But we had this nice little life set up, nice apartment, decent cars, regular date nights when I felt like it. Here's the thing though, I've always been really good at managing relationships. Like, I'm the one all my friends come to for advice because I just understand how these things work. With Gary, I had everything running smoothly. I handled our social calendar, decided which friends we'd hang out with, made sure our Facebook looked cute with couple photos. Gary's pretty laid back, so he just went along with whatever I planned. Between us, though, I always felt like I was settling a little bit. Don't get me wrong, Gary's a good guy, but he's not exactly the most exciting person in the world. Sometimes I'd watch other couples and think about how their guys would surprise them with flowers or plan these amazing dates, and Gary just didn't really do stuff like that unless I basically told him to. I'm not trying to be mean, but Gary's always been kind of predictable. He'd come home from work, we'd eat dinner, watch TV, go to bed. Weekends were grocery shopping and maybe seeing his friends if I was in the mood. It got old pretty fast. When I'd try to talk to him about spicing things up or being more romantic, he'd just nod and maybe try for like a week before going back to his usual routine. The thing that really got to me was how he handled conflict. Like, if I was upset about something, instead of just listening and making me feel better, he'd want to talk it through and understand my perspective. It was exhausting. Sometimes a girl just wants her man to apologize and move on, But Gary would always want to dig deeper and figure out the root cause or whatever. So annoying. I started making little comments here and there, nothing mean, just honest observations. Like, if he was being moody about work, I'd joke with our friends about Gary having one of his days again. Or if he didn't want to go out when I wanted to, I'd say something like, Gary's being antisocial tonight, with a laugh. He'd get all sensitive about it and say I was embarrassing him. But come on, I was just being honest about what was happening. What really bothered me was how paranoid he got about my friendships. I've always been friendly with people at work, including guys, because that's just normal adult behavior. But Gary would ask all these questions about who I was texting or why I was staying late for work, happy hours. Meanwhile, he expected me to just trust him completely when he'd mention grabbing drinks with his coworkers or whatever. The double standard was ridiculous. So yeah, a few years ago I started feeling really unfulfilled in the relationship. Gary was just so focused on work and his little routine that he wasn't paying attention to what I actually needed. I'd try to tell him I felt disconnected from him, but he'd just suggest we plan more date nights or whatever, completely missing the point. I needed someone who could see what I needed without me having to spell it out all the time. That's when I started getting closer to this guy from my work circle. It wasn't planned or anything. It just happened naturally, because he actually listened to me and made me feel appreciated. Finally, someone who understood what I was going through and didn't make me feel crazy for wanting more out of life. The connection was instant and intense. We'd talk for hours about everything, our dreams, our frustrations, what we wanted out of life. He got me in ways Gary never did. When I told him about feeling unappreciated at home, he didn't try to fix it or give me advice. He just listened and validated what I was going through. Things escalated pretty naturally from there. We started meeting up for coffee, then drinks after work, then, well, you can probably guess. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. I felt beautiful and wanted and interesting. With Gary, I'd started feeling like just another part of his routine. But with this guy, every moment felt electric. I know how this sounds, but it really wasn't about hurting Gary. It was about finally finding someone who saw my worth. The physical connection was incredible too, passionate in ways my marriage hadn't been in forever. I felt free to be completely myself without worrying about judgment or having to explain what I needed. The affair lasted about 6 months. We'd meet up a couple times a week, and those were honestly the highlights of my week. Gary never suspected anything, because he was so wrapped up in his own world. When he'd ask about my late nights, I'd just say I was hanging out with girlfriends or had work stuff. He never pushed it because that would have required him to actually pay attention to what was happening in my life. When it ended, I was devastated. My guy decided to pursue something more serious with someone else, and suddenly I was back to my regular life with Gary, feeling more trapped than ever. I couldn't exactly talk to anyone about what I was going through, so I had to deal with the heartbreak completely alone. That's when I really started seeing how inadequate Gary was as a husband. Here I was, going through real emotional pain, and he was completely oblivious. Instead, Gary just kept living his boring little life while I was falling apart inside. I started getting more frustrated with him about everything, how he never planned anything fun for us, how he'd rather watch sports than have a real conversation. After a few months of weird tension, Gary found something on my phone. I still don't know exactly what because he never told me the specifics, but one morning he woke me up and just said, "We need to talk about what's been going on." My first instinct was obviously to deny everything. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Confess to having the best 6 months of my life with someone who actually appreciated me? When he showed me whatever evidence he'd found, I played it down as much as possible. Yeah, I'd been talking to someone from work. Yeah, maybe I'd gotten a little too friendly. But it wasn't what he was thinking. We were just friends who connected on an emotional level. The whole confrontation felt so unfair. Here Gary was, going through my private messages and acting like he'd uncovered some massive conspiracy, when the reality was that I'd found someone who made me feel valued after years of being taken for granted. If anything, Gary should have been asking himself why his wife needed to find emotional support outside their marriage. But instead of self-reflection, Gary went straight into victim mode. He wanted to know every detail about my friendship, how long it had been going on, whether we'd ever met up in person. It was like being interrogated by the police. And when I tried to explain that this was really about problems in our marriage, he accused me of trying to blame him for my choices. He insisted we go to couples therapy, which was honestly a nightmare. I tried to be open about feeling neglected and unappreciated in our marriage, but the therapist and Gary just kept bringing everything back to my betrayal. Like I was trying to explain the underlying issues that led to this situation, but they wanted to focus on making me feel guilty. What made it worse was how Gary used the therapy sessions to air every grievance he'd ever had about our relationship. Suddenly, he had all these complaints about my communication style and how I handled conflict. It was like he'd been keeping a secret list of everything I did wrong, just waiting for the chance to throw it all in my face. I started lying about things just to avoid more drama. If Gary asked what I did during lunch at work, I'd make up some story about eating alone instead of mentioning that I'd grabbed food with coworkers. If someone texted me while we were together, I'd pretend it was my sister or something boring. It was easier than dealing with Gary's interrogation about every person in my life. The constant monitoring and checking up was suffocating. Gary would casually ask about my day, but I could tell he was cross-referencing everything I said with what he could verify through other sources. If I said I went to Target after work, he'd check the credit card statement. If I mentioned having lunch with someone, he'd ask follow-up questions to make sure my story was consistent. By the second year after everything came out, we'd settled into this weird routine where we looked like a normal couple on the surface but were basically strangers living in the same house. Gary had built this wall around himself that I couldn't penetrate, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to anymore. Then out of nowhere, 2 years after all the drama, Gary came home from work one day with this completely different energy. He sat me down and said we needed to have a serious conversation about our marriage. But instead of divorce talk, he started talking about how he'd been doing a lot of thinking and realized that we'd never actually dealt with the real issues in our relationship. He told me he wanted me to create a complete timeline of everything that happened, every conversation, every meeting, every text message I could remember. And then he wanted me to take a polygraph test to verify that I was telling the truth. A freaking polygraph test, like I was some kind of criminal. My stomach dropped when he said that because obviously there were things I hadn't told him. The physical stuff, for one thing. Gary knew we'd been emotionally close, but he didn't know we'd actually hooked up multiple times. He didn't know about the hotel room or the things we'd done together that I'd never done with him. For a few days, I tried to wait him out. But Gary was different this time. He wasn't angry or emotional like before. He was just cold. He'd come home from work, eat dinner in silence, and then go to his office for the rest of the night. When I tried to initiate conversations or physical affection, he'd be polite but distant. The night I finally broke down, Gary had been especially quiet all day. We'd gone to bed without really talking, and I just lay there staring at the ceiling, knowing I couldn't sleep. When I looked over at Gary, he was wide awake too, just staring at the wall on his side of the bed. I started crying and told him I couldn't take the tension anymore. He turned to look at me and just said, "Then tell me the truth." So I did. I told him everything about the hotel room, about how physical we'd gotten, about all the things I'd done with this other guy that I'd never been willing to do with Gary. Gary listened to everything without saying a word. When I finished talking, he just lay there in silence for what felt like forever. I was crying and apologizing and telling him how sorry I was for lying, expecting him to explode or storm out or something. Instead, he calmly said, "Thank you for finally being honest with me." Then he paused for a few seconds and added, "I've been sleeping with someone too." I swear, for a second, I thought I'd misheard him. I stopped crying and just stared at him, waiting for him to take it back or clarify what he meant. But he just kept looking at me with this completely neutral expression, like he'd just told me what he had for lunch. When I managed to ask him what he was talking about, he explained that he'd started seeing someone about 6 months ago. Someone from his work. Someone who'd been helping him process what had happened to our marriage and figure out what he actually wanted from a relationship. I was completely floored. After everything I'd been through, all the guilt and monitoring and therapy sessions, Gary had been doing the exact same thing I'd done. Except he'd been doing it while playing the role of the betrayed husband who was graciously trying to save our marriage. The part that really destroyed me was when he showed me a picture of her. She was gorgeous, like genuinely beautiful, in ways I'm not and never will be. Younger than me, obviously in great shape, with this confident smile that made me feel sick to my stomach. Everything about her screamed, successful woman who has her life together, which was basically the opposite of how I'd been feeling for the past 2 years. Gary explained that he'd never planned for it to happen, but after months of feeling like his wife didn't respect him enough to tell him the truth, he'd started talking to this woman about what he was going through. What killed me was how he described their relationship. It wasn't desperate or secretive like mine had been. They'd taken things slow, built a real connection, talked about their values and what they wanted from life. It sounded mature and healthy, and everything my affair hadn't been. I became completely obsessed with her. I needed to know everything. What she looked like without makeup, what she did for work, where they went on dates, what they talked about. I asked Gary question after question until he finally told me I was torturing myself and needed to stop. But I couldn't stop. I'd lie awake at night imagining them together, wondering what she had that I didn't. Gary had been with me for 8 years, and he'd never talked about me the way he talked about her. When he described their conversations, his whole face lit up. When he talked about our marriage, he sounded like he was discussing a business arrangement that wasn't working out. The worst part was finding out what they did together. Gary had always been pretty vanilla with me, but apparently with her, he was way more adventurous. Things I'd suggested over the years that he'd shown no interest in, he was doing eagerly with her. It was like he'd become a completely different person, more confident, more passionate, more willing to take risks. I started asking him detailed questions about their physical relationship, which was obviously a terrible idea. But I couldn't help myself. I needed to know if she was better than me, if he enjoyed being with her more, if she did things I wouldn't do. Gary would answer honestly, which somehow made it worse than if he'd just refused to talk about it. Our own physical relationship became this weird competition where I'd try to be more like her, more enthusiastic, more willing to try new things. But Gary could tell what I was doing, and it just made everything feel forced and pathetic. He'd stop in the middle and ask if I was okay, which made me feel even worse about myself. The comparison was killing me. She had this amazing career, her own house, a car that was way nicer than mine. She traveled constantly for work and posted these gorgeous photos from different cities. Meanwhile, I was stuck in our boring apartment, obsessing over my husband's affair, while she was out living her best life. The fights got increasingly nasty. I'd bring up every mistake Gary had ever made, every time he'd disappointed me or failed to meet my needs. He'd counter with examples of my manipulative behavior, my refusal to take responsibility, my pattern of blaming him for my choices. We were both saying things designed to hurt each other as much as possible. I started making ultimatums about Gary ending his affair, conveniently forgetting that I'd had one first and had only ended it because the other person lost interest. But Gary pointed out that he'd already offered to end it if we could build something real together, and my obsessive jealousy proved that wasn't possible. I started threatening divorce, expecting Gary to panic and beg me not to leave. Instead, he'd just nod and say that might be the healthiest option for both of us. When I'd back down and say I didn't really want to divorce, he'd point out that I was using our marriage as a weapon instead of treating it like something worth fighting for. After months of this insane back and forth, I finally told Gary I wanted a divorce. I was tired of competing with someone I'd never measure up to. Tired of being made to feel like the villain in my own marriage. Tired of watching my husband be happier with someone else than he'd ever been with me. Gary didn't fight me on it. He just asked if I was sure, and when I said yes, he nodded and said he'd start looking for a lawyer. No tears, no begging me to reconsider, no grand gestures to save our marriage, just calm acceptance that we were done. The divorce process was a nightmare. Gary had been documenting everything for months. My erratic behavior, my threats, my refusal to go to counseling, my obsessive questions about his affair. He made me look like an unstable person who'd been emotionally abusing him while he'd been trying to save our marriage. What made it worse was that people in our social circle were taking sides, and most of them were choosing Gary. Friends I'd known for years were suddenly too busy to hang out, or they'd make awkward excuses when I tried to get together. Meanwhile, Gary seemed to have unlimited support from everyone who mattered. The financial settlement was worse than I'd expected. Because I'd been the one to initiate the divorce, and because Gary had documented evidence of my emotional instability during the process, I ended up with way less than I thought I deserved. I had to find a new place to live pretty quickly. I moved into this tiny apartment across town that was honestly depressing compared to the life Gary and I had built together. Meanwhile, Gary stayed in our place and seemed to be thriving. Within a month of me moving out, I heard through mutual friends that his affair partner had basically moved in with him. Seeing them together was torture. They'd show up at the same restaurants and coffee shops Gary and I used to go to, looking completely comfortable and happy together. What really got to me was how different Gary seemed with her. He was more animated, more confident, more engaged than I'd seen him in forever. I tried dating, but it was a disaster. I'd either compare every guy to Gary or to my original affair partner, or I'd end up ranting about my ex-husband and how unfairly I'd been treated. Most guys could tell I was a mess and would ghost me after 1 or 2 dates. Work became awkward too, because I'd started using company time to check Gary's social media and complain to coworkers about my situation. My productivity tanked, and I could tell my boss was getting fed up with my personal drama affecting my job performance. When I heard that Gary and his girlfriend had gotten engaged, something inside me completely snapped. I started posting passive-aggressive stuff on social media about people who cheat on their spouses and then play victim. I'd share articles about emotional manipulation and tag mutual friends, hoping they'd realize what Gary had really done to me. But my social media campaign backfired spectacularly. Instead of people rallying to support me, they started distancing themselves even more. Someone screenshot my posts and apparently sent them to Gary because I got a cease and desist letter from his lawyer about harassment and defamation. That's when I realized how completely isolated I'd become. I had no real friends left, my family was tired of hearing about my drama, and I was facing potential legal action for trying to expose what Gary had done to me. Meanwhile, he was planning a wedding with someone who worshipped the ground he walked on. I tried reaching out to my original affair partner, thinking maybe we could reconnect now that we were both in different places in our lives. But when I found his contact information and sent him a message, he never responded. Later, I found out through social media that he and his wife had just had their second kid and looked blissfully happy. So there I was, divorced, alone, struggling financially, and watching both of the men I'd been involved with build amazing lives with other women. Gary had found someone who appreciated his stability and genuineness, and my affair partner had found someone who deserved his passion and excitement. The worst part was realizing that everyone saw me as the problem. Gary's friends, our mutual friends, even some of my own family members seemed to think I'd gotten what I deserved. They saw a woman who'd cheated on her husband, lied about it for years, and then couldn't handle it when he did the same thing. But they didn't understand the whole story. They didn't know about all the years Gary had taken me for granted, or how emotionally unavailable he'd been, or how I'd tried to tell him what I needed, and he'd just ignored me. They only saw the affair and my reaction to his affair, not the context that led to everything falling apart. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I found out they'd bought a house together in the nice part of town. The same area Gary and I had always talked about moving to, but could never afford. Apparently, with her income added to his, they could afford the life I'd always wanted but never achieved. I also heard through the grapevine that Gary had gotten a promotion at work and was doing better than ever professionally. It was like my divorce had freed him to become the person he'd always wanted to be. While I was stuck in this tiny apartment, working the same boring job and struggling to pay my bills. The final blow came when I saw their engagement photos on social media. They looked like something out of a magazine. Both of them glowing and confident and obviously crazy about each other. Gary looked happier than I'd ever seen him, even in our early dating photos. That's when I realized that Gary had never been the problem in our marriage. The problem was that I'd never been the right person for him. And instead of accepting that and letting him go, I'd spent years trying to change him into someone who would make me happy. But even with that realization, I couldn't bring myself to be genuinely happy for him. Part of me still believed that if he'd just tried harder with me, if he'd been more attentive and romantic from the beginning, none of this would have happened. I know everyone thinks I should be grateful that Gary and I both found our way to better situations. But honestly, I'm just angry. Angry that he got to move on so easily while I'm still dealing with the consequences of choices we both made. Angry that he found someone perfect while I'm alone. Angry that everyone sees him as the good guy in this story when he's just as responsible for our marriage falling apart as I am. At the end of the day, Gary abandoned our marriage the moment things got difficult, instead of fighting for what we'd built together. He took the easy way out by finding someone new instead of doing the hard work of fixing what was broken between us. But somehow, I'm the one who ended up with nothing while he got everything he ever wanted.